Hey everyone, it's Wednesday, time for Wisdom Wednesday. Thought I would talk a little bit about cholesterol this afternoon. It appears that a lot of folks really are a little confused about how cholesterol works in the body, and I thought I'd just give you a little overview. Basically, all of our cells have cholesterol. All of our cells make cholesterol. Although a lot of it is made in the liver, most of our cells make cholesterol because it's important for cell membranes. It's also important for all of our hormones, vitamin D, our female hormones, cortisol. So a lot of the body utilizes cholesterol, all cells to some degree. But not all cells can make enough, and so the liver does make some and packages it because it's a fat, and fat cannot distribute into the blood. We can't really make an emulsion, so we have to cover it with proteins. But all of the cholesterol in these proteins is the same. It's just the same molecule. It just depends on how it is packaged. And it can be packaged in a large molecule that's considered a low density molecule, or it can be packaged in a small molecule or a small package, and that's high density. But it just depends on the proteins that are around it, because in order for it to be able to be transported in a water-soluble liquid, which is what our blood is, it has to be surrounded by these proteins so that it does not just float in the blood. If you've ever put olive oil or any type of oil on top of water, you know it floats and would just be on the top. And so everything would just rise up, but it has to be able to be transported within the blood just like all cells are. So it's surrounded by these proteins. And the proteins give it its character in terms of whether or not it tends to be a sweeper and kind of cleans things back up, or if it's going to take it out into the cells and be distributed. And in certain aspects, those low density lipoproteins that have some of these interesting higher risk proteins around them, the ApoB, for instance, which is going to be on an LDL particle. The ApoA is on HDL particles. And then there's another protein strand called LP little a, or lipoprotein A. That's another high-risk particle. And these are what are affected by taking any statin. It will inhibit the production of these in the liver. But by and large, most of our cholesterol, which is the same molecule throughout the body, is made inside the cells. But what is it about these that make them more high risk or low risk? Because just knowing an LDL number really doesn't tell us. It really depends on the size of a low density lipoprotein, and that's quote unquote the bad cholesterol, but the cholesterol is the cholesterol. It's not either good nor bad. It's important. It's just a matter of, is it the protein that is carrying this cholesterol a high risk or a low risk particle? And so having just an LDL number on your blood test is really not a very robust way or a very helpful, predictable way to see whether or not you're at high risk. I have patients with LDLs that are markedly elevated and their hearts are perfectly healthy and normal and no plaque or evidence of any plaque whatsoever, and yet people with lower numbers have a lot of plaque. So what is the difference? It really is dependent on whether these particles, particularly of the LDL or low density lipoproteins, are small and dense and have some of these higher risk proteins on them that can bury into the lining of a blood vessel wall and set up an inflammatory response and set up for plaque, which then over time can occlude that vessel and therefore limit blood supply and oxygen to muscle tissue, essentially in our heart, as far as the heart is concerned, and then in the blood vessels of the brain that would be perfusing brain tissue. So it's really interesting that we have this idea that we have a good cholesterol or bad cholesterol, and that's just very poor nomenclature. It's not even correct nomenclature. It's just whether or not you have high risk type low density lipoprotein particles. And just because you have a good high density lipoprotein particle level doesn't necessarily mean that those are all great actors. They tend to be somewhat protective, but it doesn't necessarily always ring true. The other thing that's kind of interesting that I've learned recently about cholesterol is that it can be affected by how we brew our coffee. And there is a chemical in coffee called cafestol, which can limit LDL at the receptor site, and therefore keep it high in the blood, but it also can limit how it's broken down after it's done its job, and that can raise LDL. And so in people who brew coffee with a French press, which is what I've done for years, it raises that cafestol. So if you have an unexplained elevation of your low-density lipoprotein in the blood, it's possible that it is because you are brewing your coffee and you have more cafestol in your coffee, from the oil of it. It's whether you boil your coffee and or use a French press. That's not all bad. This cafestol has good anti-inflammatory aspects to it, and it also is very good for sensitizing for insulin. And so it's not necessarily all bad, but if you have unexplained LDL, it's possible that it could be the way that you brew your coffee. And so I've been doing French press for years, so I thought I would, and I've seen my LDL go up a little bit, and so I thought I would switch over to a pour over with a Chemex and using unbleached types of filter to see if perhaps there would be a difference. And it's definitely a difference in how the coffee is. It's just not as dense for sure, and it seems to be a cleaner type of brew. So it's an interesting shift for me, but it's not necessarily something I'll do all the time because I think that there's still some advantage to having this, but I just want to see what it does to the number of LDL particles that I have. So I'll be sharing that with you once I have a chance to recheck it. I just started doing this a couple weeks ago, so I may wait a month or two and recheck it. But I thought it was an interesting aspect of what even just one way of preparing a polyphenol such as coffee could have for us. So thought I would just share it with you. So in just looking back at what we've discussed today, it's really important to understand there's no good cholesterol or bad cholesterol. It's the lipoprotein particles that have impact on risk factors for plaque formation, not the cholesterol itself. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of an idea about the nomenclature and how we really should be discussing this, and that likely just doing a regular lipid panel, including cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL, and LDL is probably not enough. And if you have a markedly elevated LDL, perhaps we need to go further and dig further and do what's called an NMR evaluation of particle number, particle size. That's really where we get information. And then also looking at the ApoB, which is the protein that surrounds LDL, and the Lp(a), which is also another protein that is high risk that surrounds LDL. So hopefully you've gotten some information with that. My guy's vacuuming back here, so I'm going to let you go. You all have a great week, and we'll talk again next week.